You all for being here. What a fabulous crowd. Thank you, Rabble and Kim. Where are you, Kim? For there you are. And Octopus Books. Thank you, Stuart, for your great introductions, and it's a pleasure to be here with Carl and Mark and their new books. And we should all buy and support these books because it's really important. And we also have another author of a book on Stephen Harper. Lawrence Martin is here as well. So we have a lot of talent in this room. And just to start off on an upbeat note, you probably know, but Obama did veto his It feels like at the end of his presidency, he's beginning to be what we all hoped he would be at the beginning. But never mind, never too late to do the right thing, and we need that hope. Hope is a moral imperative. Don't ever forget that, please. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about a report that I'm just finishing. I have two reports on Harper. It's not a book, but a report I've just finished on water and the Harper agenda on water, which will be out for World Water Day. But the one that I'm just finishing now is it's called Broken Covenant, and it's on how the Harper government has set out very deliberately to break the bonds, the partnership that's been built up over 75 years. Really, if you go back with some of the institutions, it's that far. And breaking those bonds with civil society. We in Canada did not have the foundations and the rich people that the American movement had, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and so on, that funded those movements. Those movements were funded by governments. And it's really interesting, if you go back, you'll find that the governments, equally of liberal and conservative bent, bought into this notion that it was important to have a strong civil society advocacy presence. Now, mind you, that was often because the CCF and then the NDP were there pushing them. But nevertheless, even up to Mulroney, and I have to admit this because they used to say Mulroney was the worst prime minister we'd ever had, and so I can't believe I have anything good to say about him, but in comparison to what we're dealing with now, I'd have to say that yes, even Mulroney bought into this belief that it was very important to build this movement. And it's an unusual story, and going into it in depth, I really have realized, I've broken it up into 10 sections, and it's clear that the women's movement and even First Nations, with all the criticisms that we have of governments, there has been a huge advocacy and health funded. The disability movement, the culture, you name it. We've had court challenges. We've had governments actually set up environmental organizations and back rights groups across the board for decades. And they've done this in ways that are incredibly important. And when you go back and realize the history that we have, you realize we built something very important. It was kind of a bulwark against government excess. It was kind of check on government, and created very powerful civil society movements that went on to make a real change in funding or in policy. The Harper government came along, and it is my belief, after having really looked at this in this kind of depth, that one of the key planks of his policy or his platform is to destroy this bond, this partnership between government and civil society, and to do it permanently. He's doing it in a number of ways. We obviously know that he's defunded dozens and dozens of organizations, just taken away the money, and we know that he's after many others in terms of their charitable status. But he's also removed the ability of anyone to promote any kind of advocacy. They didn't kill Status of Women when they came to power. What they said was Status of Women could no longer fund any advocacy work for women. So all of the women doing work on legal advocacy or any form of human rights had to be defunded. Well, I mean, you just take the teeth out of the whole movement. Similarly, I don't know if you know recently that they brought in a new law that all funding to tribal councils and First Nations communities must be given on the condition that there's no advocacy. You're not allowed advocacy anymore. My favorite is they're challenging the charitable status of I think it's calling the Wellington Birdwatchers Association because they're concerned about neonicotinoids, which is a chemical that's linked to bee deaths, so they're in deep trouble. But the other thing that I have discovered, and I didn't know so much, and that is that there's also been a real break between the government departments and agencies that served Canadians and the institutions themselves. So it's not just civil society groups, but it's all of the government agencies and departments that facilitated that. Those are gone. I mean, 2,000 scientists are gone. But cooperatives between set up by the federal government, but understanding that they can't run them, they support these cooperatives across the country. Disability, people working with disability, knowing that the government's not going to deliver disability projects, but they are going to work with local communities. Literacy, they have totally revamped the literacy policy in this country. They've taken a lot of money out. The money that's still there is going to directly to conservative values, conservative people in the communities. Just want to give you a few quick examples of some of these institutions that are gone. The National Council of Welfare, set up in 1962, was really an incredible institution for decades, doing research and work and policy advocacy on behalf of poor people and inequality. I have a very personal connection to it because my father worked there, and he led the fight against capital punishment from the National Council of Welfare. National Association of Women in the Law, since 1977, doing incredible work, killed in 2011. First Nations, they took $60 million out of the last 2 years alone, out of First Nations advocacy. But the one that bothered me the most was the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which was set up in 1995 to help people deal with the results of residential school abuse. The Canadian Environmental Network, which was 600 groups set up in 1977, gone. The Health Council of Canada, which was more recent, set up in 2003, but came out of the Romano Commission, and its role was to ensure that the commission, that the agreement, the accord between the federal and provincial governments went ahead and did what was promised in the Romano Commission and kept that civil society vision in front of us. They're gone. Canadian Conference of the Arts was set up in 1945. Killed in 2011. It represented 400,000 artists. The Canadian Council for International Cooperation, set up in 1968, which has been just a bulwark of advocacy and put Canada on the map around the world in terms of speaking for groups around equality, poverty, and justice. Gone, or defunded. It's not gone, but it's struggling. And this one that really got me, the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, and it was set up in 1935 during the Dust Bowl to protect prairie land, to bring in projects where local communities actually regained areas called pasture land and protected soil, planted trees, protected water, and there are now pasture lands double the size of Prince Edward Island in the three prairie provinces, without asking anybody, without any kind of coordination or any kind of announcement. Just boom, the money's gone. And folks in Saskatchewan are saying, well, clearly their government's just going to turn it over to the oil and gas industry, and the whole area, these vast areas of prairie, some of the last left in the world will be gone. So I guess what I want to say is that as we come up to the next election, we have to have this concept in mind. We need to understand what's happened here. Brent Patterson in our office said it's like clear cutting, and I thought that was an incredible image. It's like trying to rebuild an old growth forest that has been clear cut. They've clear cut our movement. They've cut us off from the ties that any of us had and the ability that we had to impact government. And I think it's deliberate. And I think the notion is to make this a permanent thing that lasts way beyond the Harper government. Very much like free trade agreements, the free trade agreement creates a kind of infrastructure, a corporate framework, and it stays in place long after the government that negotiated is no longer in power. What does this mean for us? Well, I think it means that we need to make this part of the election debate. I think it means that we need to talk to the governments who may be replacing the Conservative government about how we start to rebuild. But I think the most important message that I want to leave with you in this set of remarks is that I think we're going to have to build a movement less dependent on government. And that's going to be hard. I think it's going to mean that we have to work in a different way together. It means we're going to have to trust each other a lot. It means we're going to have to be there for one another's struggles and not say, well, I've got my funding and this is my niche and that's your niche. We're not going to be able to work like that anymore. We're going to have to work faster, harder, a little more radical. After C-51 passes, I'll be in trouble for that. But I do believe that we're going to have to think of different models, and I do have to say that way back in 1985, the Council of Canadians is turning 30 years old in 2 weeks, March 11th. And when we got set up, we, of course, came together to fight the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and Brian Mulroney, and it never occurred to us to apply for charitable status, so we didn't get it in the beginning. And then for years I used to say, we'll regret it if we get charitable status. One day we'll be grateful that we don't have it. We have to build an independent movement here. And I am deeply grateful that we made that decision. We've never, in all those 30 years, accepted 1 cent from government, not that they'd ever given it to us, or 1 cent from any corporation. And it's been something that's been really tough, and there have been lean times, and people in the organization Gary and others will know that every now and then I'm not religious, but I'll spout about the loaves and fishes from the Bible, which is, don't wait for the money to come to you, don't wait for the resources. If the work has to be done, go out and do the work. We will find the resources, or they will find us, and we have to have that kind of faith. So I actually feel, I know this may sound strange, but I'm not feeling hopeless or down at all. I'm feeling very challenged, very excited about what a new day could bring. And I think that this might be a wake-up call for our movement. I think in some ways, although I deplore the assault, the termination of this movement that took so many decades and so much work to put together, I think it's a wake-up call for us to build something new, something independent, something sharper, and it's going to challenge us in a very exciting new way. And I personally want to see this as a hopeful sign and a sign of renewed democracy. So thank you.